preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, and welcome to the special summer edition of The Shape of the City, which we're doing this fall in this wild summer weather. And again, I'm Daniel Stern, Director of Humanities for the 92nd Street Y, and delighted to be here in the third stanza of our series here at the Schaffler Auditorium of Rodef Sholem. And my job is, and I've been told by somebody who shall be nameless but who runs this thing, I should keep it short instead of my usual carrying on about how wonderful Paul Goldberger is, but everyone here knows that. We also have some wonderful guests this year, including tonight's guest, Steven Holl. But just a few quick words. Paul Goldberger, as everyone who is alive in 1989 knows, is the architecture critic of the New York Times. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Architectural Criticism in 1984. He's the author of a number of books, including The City Observed, and has written essays and introductions for an extraordinary number of architectural and design shows. He has been awarded the Medal of the American Institute of Architects for his architecture criticism, and the President's Medal of the Municipal Art Society of New York in 1984. He is the sort of the jewel in the crown of our work at the Y in this field, and we're delighted to have him and delighted to have you all here for this another extraordinary evening. And now, Paul Goldberger.
Thank you very much, Dan. Welcome to all of you once again to the Y Comes to the West Side. Just as a preview of the next couple of weeks, since it's always difficult to remind you of this as everyone is leaving at the end of the evening, let me now take this chance to remind people that our guest next week is Peter Rose, Montreal-based, Yale-educated and Montreal-based architect who's designed for the Canadian Centre for Architecture. The major architecture museum in Montreal opened to considerable international attention last May. And 2 weeks from tonight, Bernard Tschumi, designer of the Parc de la Villette in Paris, one of the grands projets of Mitterrand, and the new dean of the Columbia School of Architecture, will be with us for the fifth and final evening in this series. Tonight, however, I'm very happy to welcome Steven Holl, an architect of unusual career and reputation, based in New York. He is known to many of you as the architect whose work was shown in a special exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art last year, an event that marked not only a rare achievement for an architect of his age, but a rather impressive return of the Museum of Modern Art to the business it was once in many years ago, which is showing the work of the most important younger designers. A mission rather, that it has become somewhat less committed to in recent years, with this very stunning exception of this very important exhibition. Steven Holl was born near Seattle, Washington, educated at the University of Washington, in Rome, and then at the Architectural Association in London. He worked for a year with Lawrence Halprin, the landscape designer based in San Francisco. And in 1978, came to New York and set himself up in a practice that, as I said, within a decade had produced a body of work that found itself on the walls of the Museum of Modern Art. I asked him, why did he come to New York? His answer was very simple. It was the flatness of the West Coast as an intellectual landscape and the intensity of the dialogue here, he said. He has been committed to the very difficult duality of a serious and real professional practice dealing with serious and real professional matters, and the philosophical quest of any architect with an intellectual bent. He teaches at Columbia, and as I said, has maintained a very active and busy practice, some of the results of which we will see and discuss tonight. As usual, the format will be a few minutes of slides, which Steve Holl will narrate for us, and then we'll sit on the side of the stage, talk about that and other subjects, and then toward the end of the evening, turn to all of you and invite your questions. Please write them on the index cards that are here, and at some point in mid-evening, pass them. I'll send a signal, pass them to the aisles, and the ushers will collect them and deliver them to the stage. Please now join me in welcoming Steven Holl. Steve?
Thank you, Paul. This is a rather frightening thing to try to do. I spend so much time on each project, sometimes 4 to 5 years, to try to summarize in, Paul said, maximum 24 slides and show a few projects. I thought this is almost like having a lobotomy performed on the projects. But I've done this, and I tried to organize it around Paul's topic, the shape of the city. And so I'm just going to show you 4 projects in 26 slides. I went over by 2. The first one is for a new town, which brings up the topic of the new town in America and codes. The second one is for the old European city of Berlin, brings up the topic of the role of a building in the city. The third is for an American campus, which brings up the topic, I think, of one of the most important structures or morphologies in urban design in America. And the fourth is about the sprawling American city. So we start with the first one. And this is the town of Seaside, Florida. Some of you may know it's in the Florida Panhandle by an enlightened developer, Robert Davis. And our project is for a commercial structure, which is part of forming a town square. You can see just faintly here, one building 75 feet by 75 feet, which forms part of a town square. The whole town has a series of codes, very strict, 45-foot height limit, public arcade that fronts the main square, 20 feet high and 12 feet deep. So that the idea of the town really is one of going from building code to a kind of order of architecture. And our challenge was, personally, to see if we could break that order and bring a little meaning to the town. So you can see a section here through the main building we did. The bottom level is shops, middle level is offices, top level is 2 levels of condominiums. And we broke the condominiums into 2 types of inhabitants of the town. On the close side here, facing the town square, something we call the boisterous units. There are 5 identical units, all have balconies facing the setting sun for toasting the sunset, all have jacuzzis, everyone is the same. On the far side of the screen, you see what we call the melancholic types. They face the rising sun. They, in fact, we went so far as to make them quite individual. I don't have a pointer here, I don't think. This is the house of the tragic poet, which has very narrow windows, very dark inside, and the awning is like a rag on a peasant's table. This is the house of the musician, which a kind of musical analogy of space that flows. And this is the house of the mathematician, where everything is slightly warped. And then, at first, it was a struggle because the developer thought that the idea was a little harebrained, but then he realized that he could, in fact, sell these units because they had character. They had some kind of quality of the character. And that the whole building then took on a meaning vis-a-vis the possibility of his town. You can see here the finished structure. But in regards to the topic tonight, the building also has what I would say is 4 types of public space. It has a semi-public space on the top deck. where the melancholic types meet the boisterous types. I call this the courtyard, the Society of Strangers. It has a kind of public space which is inside the arcade that they didn't envision, and we had to fight Leon Creer to allow this strange modern intrusion. It's a kind of escape from the offices where one can go out, have a coffee or a cigarette, and be in the arcade but not of it. Then it has the arcade, and then of course the space of the town square itself. Second type of relation to a building in the city is in Berlin. This is the expansion of the American Gedenkbibliothek. You can see here the existing building, which is a slab of administrative librarians and public space down below. And the important thing here is this was the first open stack library in all of Western Germany. It was built in 1954, right after the Berlin airlift, and it was a gift of the American people, and it was done by American money and a German competition. This go-around was a German money, and Americans, 15 Americans were invited to compete. The important thing we felt about the project was really it's an urban point in the city of Berlin which is unlike any other. It's on the main axis of Friedrichstrasse. For those of you who know West Berlin, this is Marienplatz, that's our site. This is Friedrichstrasse, that's Checkpoint Charlie. Here's the wall. And this is the old city, that's Unter den Linden, the work of Schinkel. So this particular site, as an urban point, and also as a public building, we felt had to be more than just an addition, a tacking on of space to that 1950s building. And you can see here an urban plan which is more than just the addition, which provides the idea of future plots, orangerie, daycare center, things that would work with the addition, which is essentially philosophically an extension of the idea of the original building, which is browsing, or the sort of free meeting of the reader in the book, a kind of browsing circuit which moves up through the new addition, over a wing which overlooks the incredible Jewish cemetery in the rear, and in a bridge that crosses the existing slab. And inside of that bridge is the children's library, where we say that the children, like Wim Wenders would say in Wings of Desire, are elevated to guardians of the city. This is a public observation deck here at the front tower point. And you can see the condition of the plots and how the building defines the urban point, makes a new whole out of the existing building and the new building. And you can see also here the curtain wall and the idea of the open stack really modulating in sort of a circuit-like network the frame of the curtain wall. The space moving up through is a special kind of space I call a shared space, which moves up through along this circuit. These are rubber ramps, very silent, that would move, which move the public through the library. And at the museum, we constructed a full-size section of the curtain wall, showing the quality of the material and the quality of light that might be passed through this almost cathedral-like light passing through this giant prism of curtain wall. The third category is an American campus, and I think in really due respect to all the possibilities of American urbanism, the campuses in America are really the strongest pieces of morphology, the relations of building and space, and true pedestrian zones. This is a very difficult project, however. This is a school of architecture, and you can see it here in the foreground, which was built in 1958, a Miesian, almost stingy kind of space, 12 feet high, 200 feet square, and the problem is to double its size. And the campus itself is a wonderful McKim-Meaden-White campus, Cass Gilbert campus. It has a great green quad, and the School of Architecture building is flanking it, and it's somehow related to the earlier campus, which was more picturesque, and so you have the collision of this neoclassical network, which is a north-south axis, and this picturesque network, and our expansion, which has to occur just on this space here. University of Minnesota, School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture. So our project really is about the relation of brackets of campus space. We picked up a series of spatial trajectories through the campus. The scheme was something that was not an a priori concept, but something that was gathered through a lot of studies, a lot of site sketches, and a lot of deliberation. And you can see the square of the building and our addition to the north, which consists of 2 lightweight metal arms and 4 masonry towers. And these bracket what would call the new centers of the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture. It's coincidental that the expansion of 100,000 square feet is actually forming a college at the university, which will be the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, and our scheme provides a kind of monastic garden to the north to complement the existing square. And the 4 towers are called what we're calling boxes of light that work 2 ways. If anybody goes on an American campus, you'll notice that one building, the lights are always on in the middle of the night. That's always the architecture building. So we thought to put these studios up in sort of beacons or towers, and they become, in a way, double functioning, because during the day they each have a different kind of light: south light, east light, west light, and north light. These are masonry towers, and you can see here just the schematic model and how that tower space actually picks up morphologically in relation to a 19th century building, which is an armory in the distance, and other 19th century buildings existing on the campus. Quality of the studio space, just a sketch. The relation of the library, you can see here with most of the glass and the offices up above, and the towers. And the last project is for the topic of the sprawling American city. I made a series of projects on this topic, totally uncommissioned and totally without anything other than the desire to make a statement about this country and the problem of sprawl and the problem of the destruction of the natural landscape, but the problem could be some kind of architectural positive statement. So there were 3 cities we studied, and I'm just going to show you a few snips of Phoenix, which is Phoenix, Arizona, which has to be one of the most difficult on the question of sprawl in terms of an American city. Some of you may have visited Phoenix or be from there, and you'll know that the interesting thing about this city is people went there to escape bad air and have dry breathing. But what happened is that there have been so many lawns planted that the humidity level of the town has actually increased unbearably, and the pollution level of cutting across the city is increased equally, so that there's an irony to Phoenix, which continues to grow. And one of the things that we decided to do was really to, instead of try to wall in the city, to try to bracket the landscape. And so we made 3 sort of C-shaped brackets which relate to the landscape. The other thing about Phoenix that haunts our project is the notion or the reality that it was the Hohokam Indians who inhabited that site for over 1,000 years and had canals, some 250 miles of canals, in perfect balance with nature and perfect balance with the desert. And a kind of curious thing is the canals were all 30 feet wide and 7 feet deep. You can see here what we're proposing is a series of what I'm calling spatial retaining bars, which are built in framing in a C-shape a part of the desert, which is held as sacred after that, and the sprawl is allowed to come right up to the base of it. These structures are 30 feet square, and they're in a concrete tube construction. Down below is a kind of pueblo-like garden court, and up in the upper levels are loft spaces, and people work up there and live up there totally in a kind of suspended state. And you can see here on the underside, we're proposing a highly polished surface of kind of pigmented concrete, so that at sunset and sunrise, at the edge of the city, you can see a kind of homage to these former inhabitants, the Hohokam Indians, in these strips 30 feet wide that block and frame the horizon. So those are my 4 topics about cities. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Stephen, let me start by saying that if there's any common thread that runs through this, it seems to be that this work is rigorously unsentimental. It's poetic, but you seem to have evolved a language, an architectural language that is seeking a kind of poetic imagery without dissolving into the sentiment that has become, and sort of the sense of sentimentality and nostalgia that seem to have become almost inevitable with most architecture in the last generation. Is that conscious? Are you consciously avoiding sentiment, or do you feel, in fact, it is sentimental in certain ways, or what?
I guess I feel it's very sentimental, or maybe too sentimental.
Okay.
I mean, some of the projects I didn't show, A House in Martha's Vineyard, which begins from a passage in Moby Dick, which is somehow reflecting on, again, former inhabitants of the site.
Right.
The concepts are sentimental in a way in their beginning points, but maybe the architecture isn't. Maybe that's
a very good distinction, I think, because in fact, when I say sentimental, I think of what I've often called sort of the Ralph Laurenization of architecture today, and you have stayed very firmly away from it, and yet you have not stayed away from it by seeking refuge in a kind of purely formalist escape, like the deconstructivists, who are just playing a set of formalist games very often as a way of avoiding confrontation with certain social realities. That you're just nodding.
It's I mean, it's a difficult question because I think you're equating sentimentality with some physical attribute on the exterior of the building.
Right.
And I must say that I've consciously tried to work for an architecture which has space, section, procession, interior potential to excite, so that the entire architectural framework is more than the skin of the building. I think we see the problem of the divorce of structure, space, light, and architectural expression, and I think that's maybe what the topic is, not sentiment.
Okay.
I think Frank Lloyd Wright was an amazingly sentimental figure in the history of American architecture, with his strange ability to go all the way down into the detail of the light fixtures, the carpets, the furniture, down to a vase on the table. Right. So that it's a strange...
Although I'm certainly not... Actually, let me stop for a minute and ask, can somebody, whoever is in the control room, raise the lights a little bit? It's sort of weirdly, I feel like we're weirdly in some strange shadow here. It's a little, somehow the last couple of weeks it's worked a little better, but if there's a way of making it not feel quite so much like...
so sentimental.
Yeah, so sentimental, right. Thank you, okay. Actually, you've got better light than we do, so it's... the issue of completeness of design from structure down to a vase, I don't think is the point. I mean, that's something you do, Wright does, and Bob Stern, who I think in many ways is a very sentimental architect, does. So that I'm not defining sentiment as that. I guess I'm defining sentiment as a kind of easy, glib emotion, which your architecture seems to try hard to avoid, while nonetheless trying to tap into deeper emotional currents. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I mean, this has been
an
effort.
Fair. It's pretty nice. So.
It's definitely intentional, and it's a long project. It's not easy to do. It's easier to say than it is to do.
Sure. I'm glad you showed Seaside, because I wanted to talk about that a little bit. You referred to it as trying to kind of beat the rules or beat the system. Because a lot of Seaside, for those who may not know it, is a community in Florida designed very much to encourage certain traditional standards of design. And there's a fair amount of wood architecture there, some of which is fairly traditional in nature, a couple of very classical buildings and so forth. And there is a set of guidelines for the design guidelines that all architects who work there have to follow. You followed the guidelines, right? You didn't break them. I think your goal...
Almost.
I mean, your goal, I think, was to try to do something different without breaking the rules, to see how far they could be pushed?
Was to build a modern building in a postmodern town, basically.
Okay, right.
And what's interesting is the result turned out to be something that Robert Davis likes very much. And in a way, it brings the town into the kind of tension that a real city has. I mean, the problem with a stylistic code is you can actually expect what the next building will look like. The trim boards, the colors even. And I think that was the challenge of building in the code, is to see how far you could push it into a different kind of architecture and still hold the city together, hold the city structure, which I believe in, this idea of making a new town that has a kind of overall plan, a structure that would create public space.
Right.
Otherwise,
So
I wouldn't have worked with it.
I mean, my sense is that this building works in part because you were not trying to break from the underlying philosophical goals of it. What you were breaking with is a sort of simplistic, superficial reading of that as just being a kind of little Disneyland theme park of cute little houses.
Right. I mean, for example, it said that any roof that wasn't a roof deck had to be 4.5 and 12 slope, which really sets a style all the way through the town, which are these little roofs.
Right.
And if you notice that barrel that's on front of the boisterous unit, it starts out at 4.5 and 12, but it's sort of, So I said, well, look, it's 4.5 and 12. It's there. And then there was another code that had the windows had to be twice as high as they are wide, but in the musicians unit there are two windows, one touching each other, so it's a corner window. And he said, are those twice as high as they are wide? I said, if you only look at one elevation, they are.
Right.
There was a number of things that went on in the process that he had to say, well,
He meaning Robert Davis?
Right.
Okay.
So he had to look the other way. Well, he had to reinterpret. In other words, the thing about a code is always its interpretation.
Sure.
I mean, we didn't break the height limit. We gave the arcade the proper dimensions, 20 by 12. The things that I think were fundamentally right. But then for a long time, they wanted the building pink, and so I had a long battle to make that building natural gray stucco, which is a kind of strange color that turns when the sun is when the clouds are out, it turns a different color than when the sun is out. So it's a kind of luminous gray that I was. And then now they like it, but still, there's a bit of tension there.
But a real city needs tension.
Right.
I mean, there's nothing more deadly than a city, as I said, that becomes Disneyland. It becomes sort of a theme park if it's too right. And it seems to me as though the challenge is to create that impossible to predict balance between too much perfection, which is impossible, and total chaos, which is total chaos. I mean, in a certain sense, it validates buildings that are very different from it by raising their context. Has the reaction been very good? I mean,
there was a public protest over the building.
Okay, that answers that
and the
question.
audience was totally, the public there was totally split. Half the people loved it and half the people hated it. There was nobody in between.
Right.
I think that's a measure of a good building. That somebody, knew it was there. There was some kind of reaction. Architecture, in a way, should make you somehow react to your environment. I mean, that's the excitement of New York. Is constantly invigorating the people that go through it. It's not something you can just take as a sort of given, as a kind of blasé background on which things operate.
But let me ask this: should architecture at the level of the city always be an intellectual challenge? Should it always be a kind of guerrilla act intellectually? Is there is there not a place for some degree of background? If everything challenges us, if everything does this, then don't they effectively cancel each other out, and don't we sort of numb ourselves to the cityscape at large when that happens?
I don't know. I think if you're going to say if there was going to be a test ground for that, it would be Tokyo, because
Okay.
Tokyo is like if you had Los Angeles and
Right.
someone put a big steel belt around it and pulled it all in, maybe 3 Los
It's a
Angeles,
great analogy.
and pulled it all in and made sort of more things, you would have Tokyo. And personally, I'm amazed how easy that city is to take, and how invigorating it is. I mean, it's a fascinating thing. I still don't understand how it can possibly be.
Right.
And there's no morphology. There's no real sort of sense of any kind of urban space that's been other than the castle or whatever. I mean, it's a very strange phenomenon, Tokyo. And yet there's a sense of scale.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sense of intimacy. There's a sense of surprise. And it keeps growing, and somehow, I mean, the subways run. You can set your watch by the subway. You get it to the subway pattern on the platform at Shinjuku Station, and there are these numbers, 9, 13, 20, and you can actually pick a number and get to that station. It runs so perfectly, unlike our subway system. So there's something strange going on in terms of what you're saying. I'm not really clear myself, but I'm not so sure that this sort of overall order that all architects have to respond to, and we plug these buildings into, and they're all set up, and they have to be all out of brick, and they all have to have slope roofs. And this might be really, in the end, something quite deadening.
Well, that's really what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, are we maybe in our culture seeking an excessive degree of gentility?
Yes,
I
I think so. Especially in New York at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's really exciting about New York is how much order there always has been and was in laying out that grid,
Yes.
that relentless order of the grid, and how much individuation has been, which has really activated this city into what it is. I mean, as soon as you start over-controlling the sort of Z dimension of the city, it starts to get something goes wrong with the whole, I think, the master plan of what the possibilities of it could be. And that's not to say that overbuilding, and some of the articles that you've written about these monster buildings, I agree with. I'm talking about the sort of architectonic possibilities, and not the 40,000 square foot floor plates of buildings that are too high. That would be
Right.
wrong from that light and air standpoint anyway.
Right. Sure. Let me jump away from your work for a minute and then ask you, what would you do if you were actually trying to plan New York at this point? Not all of it, just a word or two about where you think the process ought to go.
Well, I think the 1916 zoning law was quite a strong thing. And I think the idea of setting a geometric frame in which the buildings could be anything that the architect could dream up was really quite a strong thing. And still, in certain parts of the city, you can see amazing spaces between buildings and filling out that frame in the most inventive way. And I think when we hit around, what was it, 1959?
61 was when
61?
the zoning ordinance was changed. It was one of the great
Right.
disasters of all time. It was because they were awed by the Seagram building.
Right.
And so they thought if they changed the zoning law, we'd have a city full of Seagram buildings, which we don't.
No, and in a funny way, I think the sort of trade-off political zoning, which is going on now, is really almost immoral, and it's a problem. I think there should be a geometric plan, and one of potential,
Right.
one of the idea of the Z dimension. In the European city, the XY dimension, the ground plan, is the important thing. But our city is many times taller than it is in building section, than it is wide. So we ought to have a Z dimension plan, which is a spatial one, with a possibility of views of spaces that exist in 3 dimensions over other buildings. The possibilities are really amazing if such a plan could be made. I don't know. I mean, you asked me if I could make a plan. I'd make some plan that really accepted the grid on the ground. Maybe just the opposite of Battery Park City, where you make a ground plan and then you just fill it out to
an even
right.
height.
I would make a plan which had a real sectional dimension to it. I don't know how you would fulfill it, but
It's wonderful if you forget the sort of tradition of our law that if you own a piece of land, you own it up as far as the sky will take you. In fact, though, I suspect it will be more and more an issue as American cities confront the fact that their skylines are themselves artifacts. And I mean, there was a time when Lower Manhattan had an entirely different meaning because of a skyline that had been created not as a result of any conscious plan, but by happenstance, but which was completely obliterated by a different kind of building, and had the building that might not necessarily have caused any problem with the ground plane, but in fact completely altered the profile and the meaning of what was in the sky. You're absolutely right. It's something that I think you're absolutely right that we have to think in those terms. I sort of despair of whether there's any way to think in those terms architectonically and yet achieve any reality politically.
But maybe it's a matter of accepting the sort of blunt juxtaposition of the amazing things that occur. I mean, maybe if there was just a bulk law.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one instance I think of that I just saw the other day, it's on 57th Street where you have this Metropolitan Tower, thin glass coming down, and this other building that Pelley is doing. There's a slot of sky there that is absolutely phenomenal. When the sun comes through, or you get a reflection, and the way the blue sky is there, and these two buildings are next to one another, it's like no other possible condition.
It is incredible. It's on the one level sort of a disaster of planning, but on a certain other level, it's also quite amazing.
But is it really a disaster?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it had to do with the intransigence to the Russian tea room, which is actually in between, which refused to sell its site to either party, and I think thought that they would basically bluff their way into being bought out by either one of them, and ended up being bought out by neither one, and both buildings just went up on either side. But
that's a kind of space. I'm not
it's
making
kind of space
an argument
that
pro
exists nowhere else.
Right.
That's true.
I'm not making an argument pro developer or pro either one of those
Right.
buildings. What I'm saying is that if there's a sort of potential to the tension and the let's say the interest of our city, it has to do with understanding those as kinds of space. I mean, pieces of the sky which are shown in a different way. The city shows itself in an entirely unpredictable and different way.
Actually, those two buildings together, and then City Spire, the Helmut Jahn building 1 block south, do represent, I guess for better or for worse, they sort of embody this moment with more power than almost any other place in the city. I mean, you have this quite literal clash of modern and postmodern over the 15-foot gap of the Russian tea room, and then the sort of Helmut Jahn trying stylistically to have it both ways at once, 1 block south, and all of these three things coming 60 stories up or 70 stories up, whatever they are, coming as close to each other almost as, one end of this stage to the other. So, you actually, to go from the macro scale to something smaller, you've actually worked in Metropolitan Tower. I know you did an apartment on a high floor there. Can you tell us a little bit about the apartment, which was shown in the museum show, but you didn't show tonight? A little bit about that apartment, about that building, about working there, about what you were trying to do?
Well, in a way, it was difficult because before I went in to work, it was on the 49th floor, right in the tip of that very shrill point.
Right.
And I didn't like the building, one looks at the building and thinks. But then when you go up there and you stand in that point, it is pretty strange. You're in a different urban condition. And I thought, why not try to make an architecture that, instead of trying to cancel this, try to raise it, a dematerializing kind of. And so we tried basically with all the little moves we made to actually float the space, to dematerialize it. So we had plaster walls which were at 4 degrees. There was a ground plan which was more or less normalized, but then the wall would take off at about 4 degrees, and then it came down and hit a terrazzo floor with no base, and so that you would get an actual condition of dematerializing. And the whole, as an ensemble, it really was a phenomenal thing. The client loves it and treats it like they have a house up in Nantucket full of antiques. So when they're up there, they're on the ground, and when they're in Manhattan, they're in the sky.
Yeah, it's actually a very a stunning thing that I think raises that building to a level of intellectual seriousness as a context for that project that I'm not sure the building itself had or knew it had or whatever.
Yeah, the building is almost by accident, but the point on the corner is almost a pure piece of architecture in the sense that there's a concrete frame, and a Miesian curtain wall, which is almost like the Friedrichstrasse building of Mies, that one part of it.
Yes, sure.
And so there is something there that architecturally is a bit pure in that sense.
Yeah. Has the Pelly building next door, the postmodern tower, compromised it, do you think, or not?
Oh, we knew that was coming up, so
you designed accordingly.
Right, and we did a sandblasted glass wall with strange designs, which you can't quite see the other building. You just see light coming in.
Okay. Let me go back to Seaside for a moment and ask you about the condominiums that are named. That seemed to me, it is hard not to think of the work of John Haydock, who has done similar sort of evocative things there, the House of the Tragic Poet and so forth. Tell us a little more about what you were aspiring to thereby.
Well, I did a project before that in 1980 for reclaiming the abandoned rail line on the west side in the Chelsea. And it's a similar notion, which is the notion of individuation, the notion of making housing in a way different from the tenets of modern architecture, where housing was made by a repetition of a system or by pure typological repetition.
It was just a universal form.
Right. And to try to, at some scale, explore individuation, the notion of the character, of the uniqueness of the individual, and to try to make, let's say, an equivalence. And in the West Side Rail Line project, each house was different. And it was an exploration also of public space. But in this project, I wanted to explore a normative condition with 3 individuals. And I'm doing a project in Japan, in Fukuoka, Japan, which is 28 units, which I'm trying a completely different approach, still with this haunting thread of making housing that has a character, that gives the project of housing a sense of place, which is beyond the different coloring of walls or beyond just a superficial thing, but try to make a sectional, spatial, and in a way literary possible transformation of the problem of housing.
Didn't you do also a kind of prototypical artist housing in New York?
In Staten Island.
Staten Island, that's right.
Which was also...
Talk about that a little bit.
That was that was 1980. That was a strange project because it had was born in one evening of inspiration after going to the Picasso show at the Museum of Modern Art, which was a phenomenal show. And I was just almost shaking after seeing that show. And coming home and drawing something I was working on before, but making these sort of these 7 characters of different artisans who live in these long workshops and back up against basically a shared atelier that they all. It was again a project like the Phoenix one, which is done out of the desire to make architecture, not out of any economic driving force at all. And I guess that's another thing I really believe in. I think that architecture is such a powerful thing when you actually have a chance to build something. It takes so long, and you have to really praise someone whoever puts a good building up because it's so hard.
Mm-hmm.
But to keep the mind going and to keep the, let's say, inspiration level up, I think one has to undertake a different kind of work parallel to practice, out of necessity. You know, I don't know how one could just, every client who walks in the door, just do their work and actually sustain an inspired level in their practice. I think it would be almost impossible.
Do you fear a time when you become too busy to do this other work?
No. No, people think we're busy, but I mean, I'm not busy. But the other thing is it takes me so long to do something, who's going to wait for it? You know? I'm working on a house in Dallas now, which I've been working on and designing for 8 months. The clients are coming on Thursday again. They keep coming up from Dallas to see the progress. I mean, it's not, I'm very excited about the design, but it takes a long time. So you don't have to worry about too much work if it takes you that long. People want it right away, you know, these days, you know.
Right.
Very fast turnover. And they build it and tear it down, you know. It's just like frightening.
So you're
especially in the realm of shops. You know,
right. Well, is the paste shop still there?
It's not going to be there for long.
It's not going to be there for
long.
long?
I guess Calvin Klein is buying that building and going head to head with Laurent. They're saying he's going to. That was the rumor I heard.
Well, I know some of the other shops. This is at 72nd and Madison, the southwest corner, I guess it is. I know several of the other shops have vacated there. So that is going to go.
That's the problem.
How will it feel to be, does that change your whole view of the landmarking process and the retaining of pieces of the urban fabric?
It was a big effort. It was a project which was called Guardian Safe Depository, and it was a building made out in Fairlawn, New Jersey, which was made basically betting on the price of gold, and it was going up and up. And all of a sudden, when we finished the building, the price of gold went like that, and the developer had no way of sustaining this and didn't pay his fees, and I had put such love into this project.
I remember that project.
And it was basically torn down in 2 years. And there were a number of sandblasted glass drawings that were articulating the entrance. And somebody called me and said, there's a dumpster in front of your building. I said, can you save some of the glass? They broke every single piece of glass when they tore it down. Everything. They destroyed every single thing. So then, the only consolation I was reading actually Sullivan. And there was a passage, Sullivan in 1922 in Chicago, was on his deathbed, with a light bulb hanging over it. He spent, it was
he died in poverty. Yeah.
Really, and completely forgotten. And someone came to him at that time and said to him, they're tearing down the Sheeler Theater. Can you believe this? They're tearing, this is in Chicago where they tear everything down. And Sullivan, and Sullivan said, well, he said, if I live long enough, I'll probably see all my buildings torn down. It's only the ideas that count, which was an interesting thing. It gave me a kind of consolation because I do believe that if you have an intensity of effort and idea in a piece of architecture, it lives in some way. It lives in some form. And I don't know. The society is a strange one. I'd like to get as far away from Madison Avenue because that's even worse in terms of the turnover. When you're paying $12,000 a month rent for a little shop, it can't last long. So if you get to Seaside, Florida, probably it'll last longer.
Is there any talk, in fact, of saving pieces of the Pace shop or elements of it? Can it be done or not?
I don't know. I don't know. I couldn't do it. Right. I don't have any place to put it. I can't even keep my models
because the
scale can't afford the rent.
The scale of that is almost model-like. It could fit on the stage, that shop. And when is it going to go? Do you have any idea? I don't know.
What a terrible topic. I don't know.
I don't mean to. I don't mean to dwell on it. Only I'm only actually playing the reporter. Journalists always want information. That's all. Nothing else. Let's move to what I hope is a happier topic, which is a project that I had not known too much about until you showed it a few minutes ago, which is the architecture school at the University of Minnesota, which looked quite extraordinary to me and very much a comment on the nature of architectural education as well as the particular urban space of that campus and the relationship of that pretty bad 1950s building to something new. My first thought about it actually had nothing to do with the program of an architecture school. I have to confess to you that my first thought when I looked at it and thought about the problem of adding to that kind of modern building was, well, I don't mean that particular kind of modern building so much as the difficult problem of adding to a difficult modern building, was to sort of to wish you had done the Whitney, actually.
That's a nice compliment.
And I mean it sincerely in that I think that project shows the level of depth and complexity and resonance that is possible in a dialogue with an existing modern building that does not attempt to deny or defy its modernity, but nonetheless does not simplistically try to replicate it either.
I think that's basically, in a way, it's a very complex project, and in a certain sense, there's a real effort there to give everything spatially that the building already that doesn't have. For instance, it has these flat plates, these flat floor plates, so that in the new section there's a real sectional differentiation in the towers and in the curved space. To give a relation to campus, which the building didn't have at all. It was just a rectangle there with no dialogue at all with the campus, and to do something which really engages the campus and somehow brings it together at that point. To give a didactic role of the procession through the school a major value in the section. For instance, you enter on the North Tower, and the building really is a figure eight. One half of it round and one half of it square, and you can enter through the library on the passing by the library and by the garden, go through the first year studios, up through the second year studios, and up through the whole sequence, and the last catwalk crosses the roof of the building into that western tower, and you're in this little strange, which we thought maybe the dean would have an office there. You know? I mean, it was some sort of notion of also being able to walk through the whole school. I know at Columbia there's a very strange thing that happens, that when someone comes into the architecture school, they can walk around in the public area, but they never get to see what's going on in the studios. There's sort of a closed door.
Right.
And if you open that door, everyone looks around, you know, who's coming in. So we're trying in some ways to make a way of opening the School of Architecture to the public more on that campus, and also in that garden courtyard to make a place of refuge or a kind of cloister, which is not unlike campus structures that we've known at Oxford various times in history, but in a modern way, because it's really done in lightweight construction in that case with the garden.
Will the students want to be open to the public in that way? Or do they actually value privacy in their studios?
You know, this is something that will just have to be an experiment. And I'm sure the building will go through all sorts of transformations, you know. And in the end, also, it may not be an architecture school always. You know, when you build on a campus, you have to think that in some ways the program of a campus changes, and the campus owns the buildings. The morphology of the buildings and the way they relate to the grounds is the positive part of the campus. A lot of times you'll have different departments shifting in different ways. So by making a thin section instead of a thick section building, could be classrooms also. You know, there are no column grids in there. It's all on the exterior. So that thin section allows for the possible renovation, rejuvenation over years of the form. So that's intentional. In fact, they told us that. They kept telling us that.
That it could be something.
The university kept saying, you know, we said this
we may turn this whole place into a shopping mall, so be prepared
for
it, right?
I mean, to deal with the physical planning department of a university is like having a vice grip put on your head, you know. It's unbelievable. You know,
I'm amazed that they hired you. Actually, what?
I am. Well, it's really it's together with Ellerby Beckett, which is the biggest architectural firm, second to SOM in the U.S., and they're based in Minneapolis. So
Right.
it's a team. We're working together, which is also another vice grip on my head.
But you were the design architect.
It's like a mosquito doing a dance with an elephant. You know, it's just very hard.
Well, it's a mosquito doing a dance with an elephant in which the mosquito is supposed to lead. Right?
That's right. Very difficult.
Which is very difficult. Are they going to build it?
It's past the Board of Regents,
Wow.
and it looks very, very, on target. There's a kind of problem right now in the actual funding. It's short $2 million, and it's a $19 million building. But I think it's very almost for sure the funding is going to go through. We'll know in another month and a half.
Great.
So it's a very positive, and the dean is very much behind it. I should mention Harrison Fraker. The dean has made that possible. And I also want to just reflect a moment on that.
Sure.
Because there are over 100 schools of architecture in America, and almost in all cases, the Department of Architecture has no power, no pressure to get quality architecture on the campuses of America. So I find that there's a very strange disjuncture between.
Oh, very much so.
Here you have the highest institution, the academic world, and the school itself not having any possible relation to the physical planning department, which goes on almost like a developer building its buildings. And in this case, due to this very lively and very good dean, Harrison Fraker, this is not going to be the case. So it's very rare, It's a problem.
Prophet in his own land is without honor, right? I mean, most architecture deans really are prophets without honor in their own land, and it's very. It is amazing how many architecture schools consider that the dean's job or the school's job is to educate and not to interfere with the business of running the school, which is none of their goddamn business. And I think before Polshek, Columbia was certainly that way, and it's gotten somewhat better, and a few of them have gotten better, but it's still a problem all over the country, really. It has only begun to change. But I think that's a lot of that's just in the nature of institutions. I mean, I've always felt I actually understood that problem very well because when the newsroom of the New York Times was being redone several years ago in fake rosewood formica and orange carpeting, and I discovered that I was completely powerless to change it and stop it, and I realized that I guess my power increased in direct proportion to the distance from the headquarters building that I was, I think. So it is very much the same thing. I mean, institutions sort of have their own momentum and their own way of doing things, and they have this strange ability to believe somebody is a great expert, but it's still none of their business once you get into their field of expertise. So,
It's very surreal.
We will continue talking for several more minutes, but this is a good time to pause and remind people who do have questions that it's a good time to jot them down, and if the ushers can start collecting them, and in another, not yet, but another little while, we'll turn to them. Let me ask you about a project that I know has had some difficulties getting built, but that is formally at least as exhilarating and promising as Minnesota, which is Berlin. You won the competition for that, yet at the moment at least it does not appear to be being built. Can you tell us a little bit about the situation there?
It's a very strange one because the competition was in preparation for a number of years. There was a good jury. There was an incredible amount of meetings with the community, and because of political change in Berlin, which has been the first major political change since '45, the elections in April, after we won the competition, basically all the heads of the various departments in Berlin, including the building senator, were replaced. And the former Senator Witwer, who was instigator of the competition, was an architect. This building senator is a sociologist. And when I went to Berlin in just this July to open an exhibition of the 3 finalists in our winning scheme and to sign the contract, he made a surprise announcement. First thing he said was, "I would not build this building," which was it was like, I had just met the guy 1 minute before. Well, he, in a way, it's caused him a lot of grief because the Berlin architects are very, very vocal, and they ran ads in the newspaper, not so fast, Senator Nagel, and there's been a lot of turmoil. And he's running a so-called third round, and I'm going back in November and try somehow to, see what happens. But I think in the end, what it shows is no matter how good the intentions are, that architecture at a public level is always susceptible to the politics of the situation. And it also shows you that it's 50% the client, if not more. There can be talented architects or there can be good ideas, but it's really the clients. If there's an enlightened client who wants a good piece of architecture, like in Frankfurt, where they built like 3 or 4 wonderful buildings right along the river there, the museum by Meyer, the Unger's Museum, the Architecture Museum, and now something else is coming. And I met the fellow who's been commissioning this, and it's an enlightened building senator.
Yes.
And this is the problem. No matter how good your intentions are, you're always up against this twisting political situation.
The very idea of a title, building senator, implies a sort of wonderful confidence in the ability of the public sector to build in a serious way, even though it's been undermined in this particular case.
Maybe we need one in New York.
Right, well, or we may have too many already. I don't know. The problem is, do they intend to ask all of the finalists to resubmit?
The three second round finalists.
Which was you and who else again?
Lars Larup and Karen Van Langen.
Right. And have you been asked to make changes, or just to respond to a different program, or to what have they asked of you?
Well, that's very sticky because they have actually changed the boundary of the perimeter, and so they've allowed, they've actually unraveled.
They've changed the rules in the middle of the game.
Changed the rules, and so it's a slow unraveling of the process, and it's very difficult to see what the real intention is. I know for sure they are going to add to the library because the money's been allotted, the books are being stored in warehouses. The librarians are completely behind our project and they want to get on with it. But it doesn't look like the government is in the right. It's really difficult to see what's going to happen.
So you don't at this point have a clear sense of what will happen?
No, it's like a Kafka novel, and you're one of the characters, and nobody told you, where's the beginning and the end of this. It's a very strange process.
But the local architects are pretty much behind you?
But they have no power. And also, remember, the building senator gives all them their work for housing projects. So if they cross him too far, they don't get a housing project because there are a number of public housing. There's a lot of public projects in Berlin.
Right.
And they're all given out by the building senator. So be careful.
So he is the great king of patronage in the architecture business.
It's like Robert Davis in Seaside.
Right. But have you figured out what the problem is with? Has he actually stated what?
No, because
he objects to. And I guess that ruins the Kafkaesque quality. If he actually tells
you
what's
really
wrong.
don't know, right? So it's like Kafka telling you what the plot is right in the first sentence. It's very. I don't think he knows that, to tell you the truth, but I'm not sure. It's very strange.
Okay. Good. We have a number of interesting questions that I think will continue the level of dialogue on a high level here. So let me switch to the first of them right now. You used the word enlightened to describe some clients. What does that mean to you specifically?
Well, I think, in a way, if someone was going to commission a piece of music, and they respected the composer, and they were willing to suspend their disbelief in what it would be that he might turn out, that they could give him a program and say, this music has to be, so many minutes, and I want it in so much time, and we commission you for this amount. And I think the enlightened client has, in a certain way, to allow the architect the rein to develop the inspired project. And this is a very difficult thing, which is not to say you couldn't have limits, because limits are actually good. 45 feet high. I mean, these things are good for an architect to work, really kind of simple limits, but as soon as you have vague limits of stylistic nature or whatever, I think that there's a problem. And that would be the unenlightened client that comes to you and says, I have to have a two-door mansion, it has to have...
Kahn, once said a very beautiful and wonderful thing when somebody asked him if he preferred the kind of client who knew exactly what he wanted or the kind of client who came not knowing what he wants. And he thought for a moment, he said, I really don't like either kind. What I want is the kind of client who knows what he aspires to.
That's nice.
It's a very wonderful way to put it.
Yeah.
And who obviously, sets a certain direction, but does not expect to be able to give it definition. That's what the architect should be doing. These go all over the lot, but they're interesting, so I will, we may jump around a little bit, but I think it's a good reason. When you speak of boisterous and melancholic types, are the boisterous and melancholic drawn to different spaces, or do people become boisterous or melancholic due to living in different spaces?
What was really interesting was the experience of going down there and staying in the building just before the opening in May, and the editor of Progressive Architecture came, and we stayed in the house of the mathematician, and some of my other people from the office were in the melancholic types, and he was on the boisterous side, and he kept saying, "Why did they put me over there? I want to go to the other side."
That's very
So
funny.
there was a strange pressure, already formed in these different kinds of architecture, and maybe it's just a shorthand way of making something with some sort of, let's say, tension.
Right.
But
right.
it actually works. There is this sense of repetition in the front when you're staying in the front 5 units, and in a way, maybe you could say, okay, there was a metaphor, literary idea that drove the design, and nobody needs to be told about that. It's gone. It drops away, and then the architecture is a silent thing that just stands there. But something is still there. I don't know.
I wonder in this particular case that you described whether it wasn't just that the editor of Progressive Architecture feared terribly the thought that he was not serious enough to be on the melancholic side. But if you were working in Russia, would your work have a political? Would your work be different? I.e., does your work have a political context?
I think, in a way, the Berlin building could only be done in that site. In a funny way, I mean, there's a strange combination of forces that make this rather... I mean, Gerald McHugh said that's an uneasy building to love. And I said, well, that's a strange thing to say. He said, I didn't say I didn't like it, but it's an uneasy building to love. In a way, it comes out of the angst of that city and of that site. And I think that every piece of architecture, if you really work with a site and a situation, is going to have a different character. If you really, one thing I can say as a principle, I believe in not trying to produce a style and put it on on sites irrespective of
Right.
what those sites might be. And I think that's a tendency that happens today that I'm very consciously trying to keep away from. And so I'm sure it would be different in a different situation, on a different site.
Can you comment on a literary approach to urban design, much like the Moby Dick-inspired house? Or is it only for smaller personal projects? You may want to explain a tiny bit more about the Moby Dick house in answer to that.
Well, it was a house in Martha's Vineyard, which I had a big struggle doing because I looked around the vineyard and saw a lot of salt boxes in my first sketches. It was just a vacation house of 2,000 square feet. And those were the forms that comes to mind. And I was rereading Herman Melville's Moby Dick and came across a passage about American Indians who lived on this actual piece of called Gay Head on the island, and they would inhabit a bleached whale skeleton. They'd pull a skeleton up on a dune and put bark over it and skin over it and live in it. And I thought, that's an archetype of a house somehow. Mm-hmm. And so the house basically revolved around that as a sort of literary beginning point, but we did a very rectilinear balloon frame, but it was the skeleton of the building is outside and the rooms are on the inside. And the whole driving, let's say, the force that drives the design isn't one of just function or style, but something else. And I think one could do a whole new town plan. I mean, one only has to read Calvino's Invisible Cities to get the imagination going about the possibilities. I think for certain there could be some kind of force that drives the design which are beyond the sort of absolute functional plumbing of the streets, that could really characterize the town.
Good. Let's go on. As popular architects are often imitated, and you are popular, what do you think would be the consequence of your architecture being imitated?
Complete misreading, because if something is about a certain site and a certain place, in fact, this just happened. I got a fax from Canada, and there was a competition for a civic center up there, and the second place was a sort of rehash of our Berlin building, and it's
already without it even being built yet.
Yeah, it's terrible. I mean, because all the relations of making a circuit and going over another building. Mm-hmm. Being the reason for the bridge, they just had this from scratch and had a bridge, and what were everything gets confounded,
cheapened and ripped off.
I think that's a problem.
I mean, I would be more angry than you seem to be about something like that.
Well, it didn't win, right? It's only second place.
Well, that's true.
I mean, what if they would have won? That would have been really terrible.
Okay. Fair enough. What did you learn from Lawrence Halprin, a landscape architect? And what is your approach to working with landscape architects now?
I didn't go to work for Halprin because he was a landscape architect. I mean, I remember another sentence about Sullivan, and Sullivan was going to do an internship in Philadelphia. He went to Philadelphia because he said, I want to work for Frank Furness because he's the only architect that's working from his mind, from his head, and not just from the recreation of some kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And Furness's buildings were very strange and wonderful things. Yeah. So, and I was in San Francisco, and at that time there really weren't too many places you could work, and Halprin was doing really things from his mind. There was a statement, there was some kind of a thesis, a hypothesis, if you will, and then some project. Very strange and interesting things. So it wasn't landscape architecture, but it was interesting to work there because half the people were architects that were working there at the time. And he had a lot of big urban, strange fountains in different cities and things. And I didn't really agree with the forms that he used, the sort of strange forms. And the first thing I did there was a very geometric fountain based entirely on golden section in 3 dimension in space. and he saw it, and he really let people go. We want a fountain there. I said a fountain about a building that's sunk in the mud and somehow starts to emerge again. Fine, that was interesting. But when he saw the three-dimensional geometric part of it, he didn't like it at all. He said, "That's not the way I would do it at all." And so he's never published that. It's sort of been a hidden project.
Wow.
But it was an interesting place to work because the mind, the idea and the problem of a hypothesis, that was on the table. That was right. That was out there. That was a necessity. And landscape and architecture should always be together in some way, I think. I think they're intertwined. There should always be the conception of landscape in the architect's mind and vice versa.
Do you sense that connection is growing closer or more distant right now?
Depends on where one is working. I think in some cases it's
one sort of looks not at one's own work, but just at this society and this culture at this moment in time.
I think in some cases there are some real hopeful projects, some hopeful signs, and hopefully this could be
Right. Good.
something of the future. I think of Martha Schwartz's work and Peter Walker's work, where they're working very closely with architects.
Yeah, the Legaretta project that I just went to see in Dallas is actually, in some ways, more impressive from their standpoint and the standpoint of the dialogue between landscape and architecture than as pure architecture. In fact.
Right. It's a beautiful project.
There are a few questions about New York, actually. They're simple ones, but it'd be interesting to hear your answer. Someone asks, what are your 3 favorite urban spaces in New York City? Another questioner asks specifically for your reaction to the World Financial Center. Do you care to comment on?
Boy, what difficult questions.
I can go back to theory if those are easier for you, actually.
What I like about New York is not what's on the surface. I could say I love Central Park because it's this strange, but it's not so strange. What I like about New York are the strange things. One of the spaces, which is not a space, but is a kind of space, which I really love in some way, happens between the back of my studio on 18th Street and the other building, which is a space totally full of fire escapes. It's about 15 feet wide, and the fire escapes from 2 10-story buildings come down, and in both directions you see this, and the sun comes through this in a very phenomenal way. It's very amazing. When there's snow in there, those little strips of snow on these black fire escapes, it's absolutely, and you can actually see those kinds of spaces also in the 30s, where if a building is torn down, you get a strip of these fire escapes back up against one another. So that's a space. Another kind of space is above buildings, where 2 buildings actually on 2 adjacent party lines don't quite meet, and so there's a strip of air which is about 2 feet wide and goes up about 10 stories. And I have one right outside my window on 19th Street where pigeons fly through this slot of space. To me, that's a kind of urban space.
Oh, yeah.
And another space.
If the Pennzoil slot in Houston is, so should this be.
And then I guess my third favorite space are all the void spaces that nobody can get to that exist in this city. Like there are 8 abandoned subway stations, And you go by these abandoned subway stations and you can look out the window and there's kind of a dim light and there's a whole subway station there. We should reuse this somehow.
Did you ever go to the City Hall one? Under City Hall?
Yeah.
That's fabulous. Yeah. That's the best.
Yeah. So and there are more than subway stations. There are abandoned tunnels. Which is a kind of city that has voids that could be activated in some way, or maybe just exposed.
I have a strange sense that maybe you should have actually done the set design for Batman. Or something. You spoke of ideas. The architectural idea is the most important factor for you. Is this why your buildings have the same kind of diagrammatical appearance, almost as if you took your conceptual diagram and magnified it to the scale of a building? are you afraid that if anything distracting were detailed into the exterior of your building, that the idea would be lost?
It's a strange question because I think the idea is
Well, it's a little bit of a "did you stop beating your wife" question.
Right,
I mean,
right.
But
right.
respond as you wish.
How could you have an architecture without any ideas? I mean, what's the opposite side of the coin, you know? And an architecture without any idea is probably an architecture without intention. It's just the filling out of so many programmatic groceries. And it's also an architecture without desire, or maybe without hope, just giving in to the filling out of a program. So maybe I take it a little far in some cases, but I don't think so. Because in my own mind, the possibilities really are in how everything besides that urge, that desire to make a meaning in architecture come into play, like in the campus at the university, where the relations to the campus, somehow there's this idea about two spaces, two centers, and a figure eight, but then everything else is what actually happens. Right? That can just disappear. But it drives the design, you try to hang on to something, you know, there's something that you believe in the project. And I'd like to say also that I think this is an interesting time in architecture because I think there is not this ideological frame that you can carry from one project to the next, like there was during the period of modern architecture or during the period of various historical revivals where someone like Pugin or would carry let's say this Gothic is the correct style, and they would carry that ideological frame from one project to the next. And so my answer to this void is what I call limited concept. That given a certain situation, given a certain character of a site, a program, that one could form a force that drives the design, which is basically given up after that project is over, and it only has meaning in the lens of that project. And that's a difficult thing, but I think in a way it's a hopeful thing. It means that there's a possibility of the widest range of, let's say, stylistic characterizations and material and color and form and texture.
Do you feel your work is readable, legible to a wide range of people, to the lay public? You know, one of the most often heard defenses of postmodernism, of classicism today, and this is something that Tom Beebe said right here last week, and something that Michael Graves has continually harped upon, the idea, whether rightly or wrongly, that a certain degree of abstraction and of modernism were not inherently readable by the average person, and that there's a certain kind of conventional language that architecture has an obligation to speak. I guess my question is a two-part one there. Is that so at all? And if so, do you feel you're speaking that language or not?
You know, we just had this discussion at Columbia today with my students. I'm teaching second year now, so I went down to first year, and they start with the problem of what is the language of architecture?
Right.
And where do you start? And we have these problems that we've organized, which are basically on 3 sites. One is a series of very brittle structures called a linear problem, which is built in a desert and made out of wood sticks. And the next one is the planar problem, which is a series of courtyards made of heavy construction. And you think of passing through space and the phenomena of light and materials. And the third one unites the two in 2 small, one which is a house and one which is some sort of an object of manipulation of the environment, whether it's testing the wind or the sun. There's sort of 2 towers on a hill. So the unification of these modes from lines to planes to volumes, which is a sort of zero ground of architecture. And it always comes up, what is the language of architecture? And I think the counterpoint of that investigation might be a figure that I respect very much, Giorgio Grassi in Italy, who wrote a book just recently, which is called Architecture is a Dead Language, where the thesis basically is the readability, the form, these things have been set. They never change. And one has to continue this to make the language of architecture understood by the public. So you have two extremes here. One is the belief that inherent in the human being is the ability to invent, and the ability for the public to see that there's a level of invention there and to get a certain joy from it. And I definitely would put myself on the side of that coin and not on the side of Giorgio Grassi, who says architecture is a dead language. However, I really respect his work. And he makes fantastic buildings, very precise, but linguistically very limited. The words, the window is a window, it's a punch in the wall, it's got a certain, there's a certain precision that I love about this work, but there's a certain, let's say, messy, kind of invigorating potential, which I love about the other side of the coin, which is what we're teaching at Columbia now. I think is a very interesting time in the school with Bernard, who's coming
in 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks, as the dean, who also, I think, holds this potential in his mind philosophically that there is a kind of future in architecture which is not a dead language. I think the rest of our society, the different things that are going on, the different possibilities of transportation, experience, stands along that line too. And I don't know. It's a big question. I don't think it's going to get resolved in this generation.
I don't think we want to resolve it entirely, really. Right. Good. Great. I think actually that is as good a moment to end on as we could ask for. So thank you. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.